Good morning, everyone. My name is Alex Stinson. I'm going to be the presenter of today's webinar. Today's webinar is going to be the case study of implementing a physical screening hiring program. Just before Christmas last year, we actually had a client come to us and kind of had some unique concerns, some unique issues, and as a result, wanted to implement a pre-screening, physical screening hiring for their employees. So we're kind of using them as our case study and going through. So we'll be talking a little bit about their scenarios and how they differ from how most pre-screens are implemented, but we'll also be talking a little bit generically about physical screening and how you want to go about doing it, what you want to do, so on and so forth. I will just give everyone a little bit of a heads up. I've got a bit of a cold, so I apologize if I end up having a bit of a coughing attack or need a bit of water break. So I'll try and mute myself in those times. So we'll start off talking about MSDs because really that's usually one of the big motivators as to why someone would want to implement a pre-screening program. We'll look at what the goals are. What are you trying to achieve by putting a physical screening, initiative into place? And then we'll talk a little bit about our case study, why they differ from what we do with most of our other clients when it comes to pre-screening, and some of the challenges that they found, some of the challenges and outcomes that they had. At the end of the day, the experience was really successful, and I think everyone was really happy with the outcome. So to start off, I think these are statistics that really speak for themselves. When we talk about our work-related injuries, and these are our latest WSIB injury stats that we have from their statistical report from 2014. We don't have 2015 yet, so but we're looking at some pretty big numbers here. 62% of all males represent lost time claims. We're looking at age groups from 25 to 44. That's a big span. Nature of injury. Sprains and strains, we're still 39%. We are still leading the pack when it comes to most frequent or most common injury in the workplace. That musculoskeletal component always seems to be heading up that numbers. The number is going down, which is something to be said. But at the end of the day, 39% of all of our injuries are looking to be more MSD related. Overexertion being the main cause, low back being the main body area. So as we go through, we kind of can see the different industries, and no one's really getting out of this trend. We're all part of it. We're all seeing the same statistics that WSIB is showing, and it can be concerning for a lot of us. We need to make sure that we are able to work effectively, that we are not being hindered by people not showing up for work because they're sick or injured, and that we're being productive at the end of the day. So musculoskeletal disorders are costing our clients millions of dollars. When we're looking at the direct costs versus the indirect costs, we really find that, that whole iceberg model of what you see in a bill is really the tip of the iceberg. And when you're looking at the impact to your productivity, the amount of time and effort people like yourselves are putting in to return these people to work and to deal with WSIB and the doctors, it becomes a massive undertaking, not just from a time perspective, but from a cost perspective. And really, that's one of the main reasons why we need to try and lower our musculoskeletal disorders in the workplace. Injuries like these are cumulative over time. We're not necessarily getting them, on day one of work under normal circumstances. Okay, so what we'll talk about a little bit is kind of the fact that one of the reasons to implement a pre-screening program is because when we're starting to see really high increases of employees that don't seem to have that cumulative exposure, yet we're getting high reports of injuries, it may be an indication that there was issues going on before they reached you as an employee, which means maybe they weren't able to do the job physically to begin with because of past injuries, past illnesses, past conditions. If that's the kind of trend you're finding where, it doesn't really matter how long they've been, whether they've been there a few days, a few weeks, a few months, your injuries are coming up kind of front end loaded, then there may be an indication that as an industry, you're experiencing injuries that you didn't cause. So that's something that you need to kind of keep an eye on and a lookout for, because it's great to have an ergonomics program. I mean, at ProErgonomics we'll definitely always promote that end of things, but it's really hard to work proactively when the injuries have already started before you could even get a hold of the employees. So if you're not experiencing that cumulative exposure, that may be an indication that you are a really good candidate to implement a pre-screening program. Okay. So what is a pre-screening program? I mean, at the end of the day, we have lots of different images. I have clients that think that it's going to be kind of more like a gym experience, and I'm going to have people lifting weights, and then there's other people that really gravitate to probably the most well-known physical screening programs, and that's that of firefighters or police officers. So they have impressions that they're going to be running and jumping obstacle courses and, you know, kind of going through kind of this Navy SEAL regime. And neither of those are correct. When you do a pre-screening program properly, it really becomes an art form to try and mimic the tasks of the job as closely as possible, from not just a, you know, that we're wanting to make sure that the body is moving the same way, that the muscles are being activated the same way, so that we're really able to capture the physical load and fatiguing aspect, but also from a legal standpoint. I can't have someone who stands at on an assembly line run a kilometer in order to be able to pass a pre-screen. That is highly against any kind of legislative or legal parameters that we would have around physical testing. The physical tests have to mimic the job. They have to mimic the essential duties of the job. So when we're talking about essential duties, we need to consider that word essential duty, and we need to make sure that we're not asking people to do things that potentially we could accommodate out. So a few years ago, the Toronto School Board actually got taken to task because of physical screening they were doing with their custodial staff. This is all documented. You can read the articles online. And what they were found for was that the physical testing that they were doing was not testing the essential duties of the job. In fact, the example they used was they had to, there were two examples actually. One was that they had to lift to 62 inches because that's the shelf height in their stock rooms, and they had to be able to lift to that level. And the judge ruled that no, you know, we can lower shelving height. We could eliminate the top row of a rack, so that is not necessarily a job requirement. We could definitely accommodate that 62 inches out of it. So in cases like that, that's the first part. That's where kind of you have to be really kind of thinking outside of the box and almost doing your ergonomic interventions ahead of time to see, is this truly essential, or is this a way I could adapt this to be lesser of a load or less of a physical demand. So the second example that they had was a weight restriction. They had a weight lift limit of, I think, 60 pounds or 50 pounds. Sorry, it's been a couple of years since I read this. And the judge came back again saying that the bags of salt that were required to be lifted could be put on a cart and pushed, and that they could be opened and then kind of hand-bombed lower quantities out. So the actual full weight was actually never required to be lifted in the manner that the testing was actually asking for. So that's the first thing what we need to do. You need to develop a battery of tests that are going to highlight not only the essential duties of the job, but you also want them to highlight the physical aspects of the job. There's enough research to support that if we're able to do the highly physical aspects, that we're then going to be able to do the more sedentary aspects. So you don't necessarily need to capture every single thing that an employee does in their task. You can just kind of pull the higher demand. So if they have pushing and pulling, then they may push and pull things at 2 and 5 pounds, but then they have a push of 40 pounds. We can test on the 40 pounds, providing we've deemed it truly essential and it's a bona fide essential duty. then we can go forward with that and only do the 45-pound test, because if they're going to be able to do that, they're going to be able to do the 2 and 5 pounds without any problem at all. And the intent of this is really to protect the worker. I've been doing pre-screening probably for about, I'm going to age myself here, probably about 15 years now, and you really definitely get some preconceived notions. I've had people go through the pre-screening programs that we've gone through and said, there is no way I can do this, and that stops the process right there. That was not something they were interested in. They're like, I am going to be in agony if I try and do this job. And they themselves have taken themselves out of the pool. I have also had some of the, tiniest, most frail-looking individuals heft bags of 80 pounds, like they were bags of feathers. So, it really goes to show that from a hiring perspective or from an outside perspective, looking at it, who may be capable, we have some of our, visually what you would think, able-bodied, stronger individuals kind of backing away, maybe because, again, pre-existing conditions, maybe because they're just not the type of work that they want to do. And some people that you wouldn't necessarily typically see as being a good fit actually do have the physical stamina and are fabulous at doing that job or that type of work. So why are we wanting to pre-screen? So we kind of touched on this already. Claims, MSDs, costs, those are definitely, I would say, the leading reason why companies approach us to develop a pre-screening program. It is challenging. There's a lot of legalities about it. It's not something that we necessarily believe. Of it, but they're highly capable, and generally at all. Sorry, I was just told that my audio is cutting out. I hope I'm back now. I'm good? Okay. Sorry, my coworkers here kind of answering questions and whatnot that you may have, and she was telling me I'm cutting out. So, as I was saying, just kind of going through this, we see cost as being the big reason, because we keep having these injuries and these claims, and we need to make sure that the physical work really is fitting the person that we're hiring to do it. I don't think anyone can argue with me and say that not everyone is cut out for every type of industry out there. When I first started, I started out in mining, and I was one of the only females, and most of it was because the workload, the physical strength that they had to have really did become an essential duty, and it was very challenging for any females that weren't, let's see, physically fit or superior in that realm to kind of do that work easily or without injury. So there's been plenty of times where, whether it's been paramedics I've been taking through the physical screening, or a manufacturing company that has to load 50 to 80 pound bags of unbalanced ingredients, I know I'm not going to be a strong candidate for those types of jobs, just because of having to reset up after everybody and how the impact that comes on my body. So we're really wanting to make sure that to lower these injury costs, that we're getting a right fit. And that becomes really challenging when we're looking at what we're now deeming the industrial athlete. We have heavy work, we have static work, we have repetitious work, awkward work, hazardous work. Notice how all of those are ergonomic or MSD hazards that I'm listing there. But that is what our industries are looking like. We have physically taxing work that people have to come to for long hours, day after day. And if you are in an industry, if you are a nurse, if you are a paramedic, if you are a transportation driver, you may not work for the same company, but you are definitely going to do the same tasks again and again and again. And that is predominantly where we see the benefit of that pre-screening model really come and work for not only the employee but also for the company, in that when they go through the battery of tests, it highlights whether or not that person is physically capable. So if they've gone through, been doing this for many years, maybe have experienced some kind of injury or, you know, something that diminishes their physical ability to do the job, as a company, you're going to be able to highlight that and then make the decisions on what to do. Most of our clients choose to do what we call post-offer pre-employment screening, which means you have provided an offer that is conditional upon them being able to physically complete the essential duties of the job. So upon passing, they have the job, but they do need to show or demonstrate the ability to do the physical demands that you've outlined in the test that you've determined are going to be representative of the work that you're doing. The other big reason why companies, specifically over the last probably 5 to 8 years, have started coming into doing physical screening is the whole aging workforce. We recognize that there is tons and tons of valuable work that our aging workforce can do, but we also recognize that it may not be the most physical work that they can be contributing to, and that our older workers, although highly experienced and may not have the physical capacity to do the work that they were doing or continue to go through. And this was actually one of many factors, actually, but one of the factors that came in with our case study. We also have just the social responsibility. No one is actively trying to hurt our employees. However, we have industries and sayings where, it's just nature of the beast. And that's something that if I didn't hear it once when I was in the mining industry, or for that matter, manufacturing or production or, nursing, I mean, the list goes on, but we recognize the high, heavy elements, but we also recognize that this is the job, this is what it requires us to do. There's not a ton that we can do about that. And yet, at the end of the day, we're still not looking to have people get hurt. So on top of trying to look at, your whole ergonomics approach, making sure that your engineering controls are being looked at and implementation and change is kind of a constant fluid program within your organization, but to look at making sure if the employee is not going to look out for their best interest that we are, and if they physically can't do this job, why would we want to put them in it so that they can end up hurting themselves? And unfortunately, in some of these industries, we're not talking, about, ice and stretch it for a week and we're back to good. We're talking about highly disabling injuries that could potentially stop these people from, picking up their kids, sleeping through the night, participating in the activities that they love to do on their own time. So we have a little bit of a balancing of the scales where, yes, we understand that the need to be employed and provide financial resources to your family is highly important, but you need to be able to do that without physically breaking yourself. So a lot of the pre-screening is coming in from a kind of a social responsibility side where we don't want to hurt you. We need to just make sure that you're going to be a good fit for this job so that we're both able to get out of it what we want. We've also found that although at the onset employees generally kind of balk at a pre-screening program, they don't understand, they're very afraid. As I said before, they often have these images of, obstacle courses and, I don't know, treadmills or going for runs and VO2 max equipment, and that's not necessarily what a pre-screening is going to look like. We may have elements of that medical, observation component, because obviously we need to be sure that everything is going safe and sound and that we're not injuring or hurting anyone. But at the end of the day, the tests should look very similar to the job that they're going to be doing. And in fact, I'm trying to actually think of a client that we're doing testing with where we don't actually have them out on the floor or in a mock room where we have set up exactly the equipment that they would be using. And the reason we do that is because you're not going to have a hard time defending, if that ever came about in a human rights, conversation, that this is not actually what they will be doing. If they're handling the product, if they're on the line working at the same heights, if they're in the same environment, the more similarities you can bring into your test, the more validity you're going to have, and therefore we make things fair. And that's the one thing that the employees have really come back as kind of a post-offer, post-offer, kind of speaking two languages, but offering post information or feedback to us, is that once they've gone through the testing, they realized how very physically similar it is to the job, and their comments are, if you can't do that test, you have no business doing this job. Our goal and the social responsibility component is really just to find a better fit. We want to match the employee that can do that type of work with the job that's asking for it to be done. Our job is not to try and, fail everybody or weed out everyone so that, our HR people are not scrambling to find a workforce to begin with. If that's the case, we usually come back to our clients and say, if we're having trouble finding people that can do this job, then we need to look at some serious engineering controls. And I think in my career, that has only happened once, and management had already identified that fact before they even got the results from the pre-screen, and had already put in a budget to bring about a certain amount of automation that would take the load that was crippling everyone out of the testing so that it could be automatically done. So we were able to get a really good win-win there, even though it sounded horrible to begin with. Sorry, I'm just going to have a bit of a coughing break. I'll be back in just 1 second. Okay, sorry about that time of year, I guess. Okay, so with our case study, as I said, we've built and developed tests, whether it be for, our hospital, paramedic, automotive, I'm trying to think, manufacturing of varying production kinds, foundries. So really, there's no limitation on who can implement a pre-screening. Usually the common denominator is the jobs are usually very physical, and there's not much you can do about it. So when you think about your healthcare, your hospitals, at the end of the day, people are going to weigh what they're going to weigh. People are unpredictable. We can engineer and help as much as we can, but some of these aspects are, again, as I said earlier, the nature of the beast. And how are we to manage that if this is just our industry? So in this case, it was actually an automotive warehousing industry, which you wouldn't necessarily think as being hugely taxing, I guess, is when you kind of look at the huge spectrum of what different industries are out there. But they were having kind of a different issue. So as I said, most of our clients come to us to do post-offer pre-employment. So it's a completely new hire. It's someone off the street, and they're not really overly familiar with your industry or what it is you do. So it is a great point to not only introduce them to what they'll be doing and let them make the decision on whether that's going to be right for them, but also, kind of have not little, but fewer issues when it comes to those failed tests, because at the end of the day, it is preconditioned that they pass the test in order for their hiring to go through. So if they don't, it's a little bit more black and white. This company was actually doing an internal pre-screening program, and it ended up being a health and safety plus the human resources department initiative. They came together. They had identified that what was happening was they were amalgamating two sites. So when they had two sites, they had a shunt truck driver who would basically stay on one site and just shunt trucks in and out of bays all day long. And it was highly frequent, highly repetitive, lots of up and down. And then they would have their shuttle transport drivers, which would, on a much, much lower frequency, take these transport trucks across to the other site. And they would have more driving, less physical aspect. Well, because of the amalgamation of the site, the shuttle truck driver was really in an obsolete position. And now we had more employees than we had positions in this department. And the company was really concerned that some of these employees, not everyone was going to be a fit for this new job. And how are we going to be able to make sure that these employees are really being placed where they needed to go? There was never at any point, because they were already hirees, any intention to let anyone go. But it was all about finding where in the organization were they really going to fit best. So they had X number of jobs, they needed to fill them. And so they needed to figure out of the people that they didn't, who would be a better fit to move. So they ended up in a very, very short period of time. I think it was, I don't know, it felt crazy at the time anyways, but we tested 48 employees on all shifts, and we were looking at trying to determine that suitability of the worker for both the existing and alternative departments in the organization or the company. So where we really came into what we were trying to do was trying to make sure that, as I said, aging workforce came into it, general health and the physical ability came into it, as well as HR being hindered with who they could keep, who they could take. They did not want to lose anyone. That was the main stated kind of message, was that there's no need for anyone to be fired. We have positions within the organization. This loss of a position doesn't mean they don't have a job. We just need to make sure that they're doing the work that they can physically do and that we're not going to be injuring someone. And that was their driving force. If they did not want to, from a social responsibility, have those injuries creep up on them and have those people coming hurt when they kind of knew that not everyone was going to be able to do this new duty. But also, they didn't want the claims. They didn't want the cost that they knew was going to be associated if they just turned a blind eye. So how did they do it, or how did we do it? How did we work together to do it? At the end of the day, we started off by making sure we understood what those essential duties of the jobs were. So we went out and we looked at doing a physical demand assessment. It really is going to be your foundational point for any pre-screening or hiring screening you're going to be doing. Without those essential duties, you can't develop valid tests. Without the valid test, you have a broken testing system, which could cause you huge legal ramifications. So as I said, these aren't necessarily programs that we recommend for every client that we have. Because of those legal ramifications, it's sometimes just not worth. If you have fairly moderate to low physical requirements of the job, there's really not a need. Anything there, you should be able to potentially, engineer the risk out so that everyone should be able to do it. But we all understand that there's certain industries where that's not 100% possible. So making sure that those frequencies, those durations, those weights, those forces were all measured and validated. You can't ask someone to just pull as hard as they possibly can when they never will have to do that. I need to know what limit I need to get people to push or pull to, what weights I need them to lift. Again, making sure that I've already taken into consideration potential engineering controls that could easily be used to reduce the physical load, any modifications that I see. That became a bit of a conversation. What could we look at changing? So really, when it came to this transport truck, a truck's a truck. I can't really do much about that. I can't do much about the fact that they're sitting, that they have to get up and down because they're shunting these trucks on a daily basis. There was numerous physical points that it was the nature of the job, and no matter how much ergonomic intervention I wanted to throw at it, certain components of this job were not going to change. And because of that, and one of them being the weather. Living in Canada as we do, relatively north, I guess, of our central region, and the a lot of the physicality of the job came in the unpredictability of the weather, where ice and snow and things would make things physically harder for the employees. So taking those things into consideration. It became quite the study, and there's a lot of research involved to make sure that you're getting the right test. But at the end of the day, again, I've never developed a program where the employees did not feel that the tests were highly representative of the job. A lot of the time, we choose to test, specifically if it's for a new hire type program, we will validate the testing by testing current employees. So we have an opportunity to get their feedback. In fact, one of the testings that we did was for a group of paramedics, and the testing scenarios that we created, they came back and said, you need to make it harder. This does not represent our job at all. This is way too easy. What we do on a daily basis is considerably harder and way more stressful. So we had to go back and we had to look at, we'd taken things like the average adult. We didn't consider that probably the patient or client, I guess, patient, in this case, usually aren't necessarily our healthy individuals. They're usually our unhealthy, more overweight, more obese individuals. So therefore, it really swung our parabolic curve on what weight spectrum we used for that group. So again, when we develop those tests, we need to make sure that they're going to be representative. And it's the employees themselves that really kind of take hold of that part for their own interests, because obviously they don't want people going off either, because it puts more work on themselves. But also, I think they enjoy being involved in that process. In this particular case, because we were going to be testing those employees that actually do the job, that opportunity wasn't there, but the feedback afterwards was still the same, that if they can't do this, they can't do the job. So we develop our tests in kind of a two-phase system. One has nothing necessarily to do, per se, anyways, I'll say that kind of as a footnote, with the job, and doesn't necessarily mean they're not going to be hired or not going to be offered a position. It has nothing to do with HR whatsoever. It is really to do with us as registered kinesiologists and certified professional ergonomists and our duty of care, and it is a battery of just basic health tests. We need to ensure that as we're going through the testing, we don't want anyone hurt, we don't want anyone injured. So the first part of that is to make sure we take blood pressures, we take range of motions, that the people that we're seeing aren't going to get hurt just from doing the pre-screening component. And then we go into those tests that are mimicking the essential duties of the job. We've already developed them with those accommodated controls being removed from the physical aspect of the job, and we've validated them. So there's different ways we can validate them. In this case, we validate them through measurements and the physical demand assessments and all of the different information that we had from HR. So, taking that a step forward, as I said, in the past, we will also, if it's a post-offer type of program, we'll validate it through the own employees. The next part, and often the hardest part to determining any pre-screening program, is determining what is going to be an acceptable path. Who is going to pass? Who is going to fail? At what point do we want to, be looking at these things? And really, when you look at the biophysical data that, physiology has put out there for, decades and decades, we're looking at heart rates and blood pressures. They need to be at a certain level. Our body should not be working 8+ hours a day at an 80% of our maximum heart rate kind of rate. It's not healthy, it's not wise, and it's definitely going to lead to not just muscular but metabolic burnout and a lot of other things that kind of come with that. So we're always looking to make sure that our testing ranges are keeping individuals at a relatively low heart rate or working heart rate. We need to make sure that they're not discriminating. We usually use the Carvolin theorem when we're doing, or the heart rate reserve theorem for those of you that have a background in physiology or anatomy, and that way we're not discriminating people against that have high anxiety levels or are older. We want to make sure, again, if this was to go to a human rights tribunal, that there's nothing embedded in the test that overtly discriminates against anyone, because that's not the intention. Our intention is not to just pick a specific group of people and say, no, you can't do this job. We want people's own abilities and own, physical aspects to tell the story on whether they can or cannot. Because at the end of the day, this is about safety first, and we need to make sure, whether it's through the preliminary testing that we do from our kind of duty of care aspect, the validation of the test, or that the pass-fail criteria are not going to be harmful to anyone. And at the end of the day, we can't fail everyone. At the end of the day, you as hirers, as companies that need people for a hiring pool, you can't work with a test that is going to fail absolutely everybody that comes in. That would be an ineffective test. And we need to make sure that the percentage that don't do it truly are the people that are going to be hurt, and not just that you've built a test that's so physically impossible that you now don't have any hiring pool to hire from. So with this company, because it was internal, you kind of come across pros and cons. The pros were they had access to the employees leading up to this initiative. So there was not only lots of meetings from the upper management side about how they were going to roll this out, how they were going to do it, but they made concerted efforts to make sure there was multi-tiered communications to the employees. There was letters sent out with payrolls. There was kind of pre-shift meetings where the opportunity was for the employees to ask questions, vent in some cases, because specifically when people now are kind of under the impression that they're going to lose their job. Again, that wasn't the intent. It was really important that they got to hear that they got to listen to the message of why we were doing this, what was happening, what were the kind of contributing factors to bring this about, because obviously it's new and different, and address their questions and kind of calm them down and settle their fears. I also gave them the opportunity to talk about the scheduling and the pace, and even ask questions, because since the HR and the health and safety departments had the program with them, they were actually able to speak to and kind of, again, settle some of the uncertainties of the employees by describing what the tests were going to be about. And by doing so, also kind of have this open door policy where if at any point in time, please come talk to us. You don't necessarily want to throw a program like this, really, even if it is a pre-hire, just out there without having that employee communication piece. Depending on your industry, a lot of the clients that we have, although are major employers, they are major employers maybe in a small town. So we're talking about friends that are hiring, family that are coming into the company. So whether or not they feel it's their job or not, that could be in question. They're going to get fearful for the people that they know are going to apply. And that has come up a lot for us. I know at least 3 of our clients that do this. Again, smaller town, big company, small town, and there's always concerns by the employees that have been working there for years that, is the testing still okay? Is it all right? Is it valid? Is it legitimate? All of these questions come up because they know their nephew is going to be going through it, or their husband or sister, or so on and so forth. So this company really took a really aggressive stance on their communication piece, making sure that employees had lots of information up front and that they were able to ask questions at multiple levels, supervisors right up to the HR manager and so on and so forth. So there was then the implementation of the test. So as I said, this was just before Christmas. So we were in winter, even though our winter was a little late arriving this year. But and it's a transport. So there was the problem of how are we going to develop tests for a transport truck in a kind of confined and safe environment, because At this point, I'm not willing to have someone slip, trip, or fall. I mean, I never am technically, but that's definitely not something I want to add to the testing scenario because that's not consistent. I can't say that the ice is going to be there for every employee or that every employee is going to hit the ice and that's going to be part of the testing. So it was really important that we were able to kind of have a controlled environment to do this in, as well as the fact that we were actually using the trucks as part of our test parameters. So they brought a truck in for us. They brought a truck inside the building for us and cordoned off a section of their plant for us to do this testing for the months basically that we were there testing these employees. So they had obviously a very big commitment to this program. It's not easy for most of us to give up real estate in our plants, and nor is it easy to bring a transport truck inside the building. But they did. They moved mountains to make sure that the test was going to be as valid as it possibly could. We then went through kind of the legal parameters where we had employees have the ability to then speak to the consultants or ourselves, signing your consent form, making sure they're aware of what was going to happen, making sure, and this is kind of an interesting point for maybe how we do screening as opposed to how others do it. But when we do physical testing, we don't give any numbered results to the employer. So the concept that the fact that, you know, I don't know, I'm on heart medication, or I have high blood pressure, or I don't know, I can only grip to 30 pounds. It doesn't really matter. Whatever number I'm getting, all of the objective information data that I'm collecting from the employees when we're going through this testing subject never gets relayed to the employer. This is us. This is how we do our testing, and it's predominantly to ensure that we can safeguard our clients against discrimination lawsuits. It's not going to be a matter of, oh, you hired them because they had a higher grip strength, or oh, you failed, you didn't hire me because I had higher blood pressure than that person. There is no objective information in that matter passed along. They only get, were they able to do the components of the test, yes or no. And we may break down those components and say, you know, we had 4 tests. Test 1 they passed, test 2 they passed, test 3 they failed, test 4 they passed. You know, depending on what quality of information the client wants, we can do that. But that is something that's kind of unique, that we make sure during that consent period that the employees know that whatever goes on between myself and an employee during testing, it stays between us, and that the information passed along to the employer, not just for the employee's sake, but for the employer's sake, is purely verbal yes and no. It's quite minimal actually in its scope, which also settles the employees. They feel like that's a trust factor that's on their side, and that you know, all of their personal information isn't being passed on to the managers or the supervisors, so on and so forth. We also use a PRQ Plus. It's a physical readiness questionnaire. Many of you may have taken them if you've ever gone to start up with a gym or trainer. But basically, it's asking the employee to commit that they are physically able to do these jobs. And it's a great screen to kind of get the employee to think about their health in a different way. It's kind of a 3-phase system. First phase, basically, it asks yes or no questions. If you say yes to any of them, then you go into the second phase and ask more detailed questions. So, for instance, if I have had a heart attack in the past, it's then going to ask me, is it being controlled? Have I had any issues within the last 6 months? Have I ever been told by a doctor not to do physical activity of any strenuous nature? And again, if they say no to all of those, then they can sign off and I can go with the test. If they say yes to any of those, still doesn't mean they can't do the test. It just means that from my perspective, again, as a kinesiologist and certified ergonomist, I need it from an ethical standpoint to make sure that there's medical clearance. They do that, and also the employer obviously wants that kind of okay as well from a safety perspective. So this test actually had 4 main physical parts aside from all of the medical kind of questionnaires that we go through. And there was definitely challenges. I mean, as I said, the whole developing of the test was challenging, and how we were going to do that in a safe manner, a controlled manner, because every employee or candidate, if it's a pre-hire, needs to experience the same thing. You can't have variables coming in and out, because that becomes unfair and it messes with the validity of your testing. So we had definitely some difficulties and challenges conveying the purpose of the pre-screening. Again, all of those fears and uncertainties from the employees. Some people participated in those communication sessions more than others. So there was definitely a handful of people that, upon walking in and seeing myself and Chris, my coworker who were doing the testing, we definitely kind of got a little bit of venting about how, you know, they didn't know about it and so on and so forth, when really there was every opportunity for them to know and learn and participate in the program leading up to before we even arrived. In fact, they even participating in the development of the physical demands assessment. We had a number of people involved in that process, and intentionally to make sure that they understood what it was we were doing. Again, that whole, because of the nature of the job, proving validity and making sure that any legal ramifications were minimized. We had, I would say during this specific scenario with this case study, I think we had 3 people call their lawyer before they initiated anything. And in every case, we had some people go, we provided them with the program, so the lawyer looked it over and they came back and we had to just find another slot for them on another day. But in every case, the lawyer said, you're fine, do the test. It's in your best interest. So that was really interesting, really positive point for not only ourselves, but also for the client as well. And at the end of the day, you know, you think of some of the physical aspects and how people are going to fare. We didn't necessarily have jobs in this one department, the shuttle department for everyone, but they pretty much did. But they really were looking for that safety component to make sure that they were not going to be putting someone into a job that was really going to be hurting them, specifically when they knew they had lots of other opportunities in this place for people to work safe or safer, shall we say. So of 48 employees that we tested, we had a 6.25% of the employees didn't pass. We had every employee say that the test was fair and that the test that they did very much represented their job. And some of them, they said, well, this is a little bit more than what I would do, and the explanation is, well, yes, but we're not able to test you over an 8-hour full week period. We have a finite amount of time. So at the end of the day, not only did we have the employees buy in and a relatively low pass rate, depending on the industry, I've had pass rates almost as high as 25%, maybe even 30%. So, but those are generally new hires, people off the street who have, never done the work, zero conditioning, understanding what they're getting themselves into, and yeah, it's usually a little bit higher with new hires, but they had a 6.25%. And at the end of the day, the company's intention is that going forward, any new hires will be required to do this, not only from a legal, fair perspective, but again, going back to that social responsibility, that lowering the cost of injuries. They wanted to make sure that this is something they embed in their culture and in their safety program so that they are actually not hurting people and they're giving their employees the best opportunity for success. So that is it for today's webinar. I'm just going to highlight the next two. Normally we do webinars once a month. However, this next, I guess our spring season is a little bit more of a flurry. Most of you are probably aware of the new legislation that just came out with WSIB concerning the PTSD claim acceptance and the new legislation around that. So Jennifer McGillis, one of the co-owners of the company, will be hosting a cognitive demands assessment on April 28th. and going over kind of the impacts of that PTSD legislation, how the cognitive demand is going to help and work with you, and how that's going to all work out. As well, there is a Durham conference coming up, a Durham Ergonomic Conference, and there is a pre-conference webinar on May 3rd that will be available for those of you that are interested. I have a couple of questions. I just need to understand. All right, so a couple of the questions are, so we have someone asking, what if the employee does not pass the test and then says we must accommodate them? So generally speaking, if you are doing a new hire test, that usually I've not had that come into play. You've not hired them yet. Your hiring practice is conditional upon that. So if they don't pass the test, there is no requirement to provide accommodation to someone that's not an employee. So that wasn't a problem for most of our new hires. Now that was a concern for this client, for this case study, because as I said, they were internal employees. They had a little bit more, well, obviously a little bit more working knowledge of what the other jobs were, what was possible, what could be done. So that's where you really need to make sure you've taken that accommodation point out. You need to be able to say, you know, we can accommodate you, and this is the stance that the company took, is you're not losing your job. We can accommodate you. It's just not in this position. Because we'd already looked forward, front, side to side, and backwards on how we could possibly provide tools, provide different strategies, looked at, you know, on any kind of, even different trucks going forward on how we could try and take out some of the, you know, really physical, I mean, being able to accommodate getting in and out of a truck. We couldn't do it. We couldn't figure out a different way to stop the constant up and down that these employees were required to do. So we were actually in a good position to, if an employee did come up with that scenario and say, well, you must accommodate them, the company already knew that they could. It just wouldn't be in that position. And in talking to lawyers, that's really the requirement. We don't want it because it was an internal program. The idea was not that anyone was to lose their job, it was just going for fit, and that really it comes down to an accommodation aspect. So make sure if you are going to be doing an internal position that no one really can lose their job if they've already been hired. We do have a duty to accommodate. So again, if you're going to be doing an internal or a transfer, which we often will do if someone's, you know, kind of in one area of the plant, but you've deemed another area of the plant to be considerably higher physical demand, and you require your internal employees to complete a physical screen in order to get into that department. As long as they're not losing the job that they had in applying for that, then your accommodation area is clear. It's only when you choose to terminate that employee because of the physical test who's already been hired that you would come into ramifications from the Employment Standard Act. I hope that answers your question on that one. The next question is, you mentioned legal concerns when talking about why to implement a screen. What types of legalities do you consider to be aware of an employer when conducting a physical screen? The big one is just that duty to accommodate, making sure that if you're going to be doing a pre-screening program, that you're not going to be hit up with a human rights complaint on the heels of that. So there are pre-screens out there, and I gave you the example, and I mean the Toronto School Board District is hardly a small-time employer, and I'm sure they did their due diligence when implementing their program, but they really did not consider the fact that if there was something that they could do to lower the business. going on. As I said, in one aspect, we also needed to be aware of how we were developing our cutoff. So they okay. The whole, sorry, apparently my sound went out. The whole question cut out? Okay. So the question, sorry, the question was, you mentioned legal concerns when talking about why to implement a screen. Basically, what are they? And I was saying that essentially the main concern is human rights, in that we are looking to make sure that there's people aren't feeling their civil rights for employment are being compromised, that discrimination is not occurring. And in order to do that, we need to make sure that we have looked at the job to make sure that those essential duties are there. So if a lawyer could come in and look at your job and say, well, could you not provide a lift assist to do that? And you said, well, yes, but we don't. Then we have not provided a good, valid testing protocol for you, because there is ways to allow people with lesser physical demands to do that job without discriminating against maybe size, gender, or muscle mass, for lack of a better term. As I was mentioning earlier, also how the data is collected needs to be considered. There's different physiological calculations that we can do, and there's lots that are used for, let's say, that would of us have heard of, what percentage of our max. Well, that becomes challenging in a high-stress situation. So we would be discriminating against people with high anxiety, potentially mental illness issues in that scenario. We need to make sure we weren't using that methodology so that we weren't just discriminating against those individuals, as well as, that whole percentage of your max thing is based on an age component, and we needed to make sure we took that in, because, again, that's going to be part of the legalities of making sure that we're not going to be compromising the human rights of our individuals or our potential candidates. And really, from an employer standpoint, that's not the intent of the testing. You're not interested on screening out our aging workforce. We're just wanting to make sure that our aging workforce is physically capable of doing the job. And from my experience, I've been into some very, very physically demanding work areas, and often more often than not, actually, you'll find that it, doesn't have anyone in the department under the age of 58. And it really, specifically at this point in time, and these are gentlemen, or that usually gentlemen, some women, but they grew up on farms. They know how to use their body. They're physically fit. There's no reason why these individuals should not be given the job, because they not only do it well, but they do it better than most 20-year-olds. So making sure that your testing program doesn't discriminate is really your highest legal concern. And as the other question alluded to, making sure that you're not going to be put into a position where that duty to accommodate is answered as, yes, you could accommodate them in that position. You need to make sure that going into that test that you know that you can't. This is the physical demands in its essence, like in its essential form. So in everything that we could accommodate it, we've already done it. Okay, I think that's it for questions. I apologize for the sound coming in and out. I'm not quite sure why that was. Hopefully you heard most of it. As I said before, the next two, we have kind of two webinars coming up fairly close together. The webinar on the 3rd is going to be a do-it-yourself, how to implement a ergonomics program, and kind of on a multidisciplinary level. So we're looking forward to both of those. I think they're going to be extremely helpful for anyone who's wanting to attend, whether or not you have a robust program or one that's just starting off the ground. So that is it for me. I hope you guys have a great weekend, and we will see you soon. Take care.